The Letter, the Witch, and the Ring by John Bellairs, Chapter 9. The Sipes farmhouse was big and white, with a wide screened-in porch. Spirea bushes grew next to the porch, and there were peony bushes in the front yard. A large apple tree grew on one side of the house, and from one of its saggy limbs hung a tractor tire on a rope. There were kids' things scattered all over the yard: baseball bats, bicycles, tricycles, puzzles, dolls, toy trucks, and plastic machine guns, things like that. But when Aggie opened the front door, Rosarita was struck by how neat and clean the house was inside. All the woodwork shone with polish, and there were doilies and embroidered runners on all the tables, chests, and shelves. There was a flowered carpet on the staircase, and a shelf clock ticking in the front hall. A pleasant smell of cooking was in the air. Aggie took Rosarita straight to the kitchen, and introduced her to her mother. Mrs. Sipes had the same long face and worry eyebrows that her daughter had, but she seemed friendly enough. She wiped her floury hands on her apron and greeted Rosarita warmly. "Hi! Glad to meet you. I wondered what was keeping Aggie. I rang the bell for lunch about 5 times, and I had just about given up on her. What did you say your name was?" Rosarita hesitated just a second. Rosemary. Rosemary Potts." "What a nice name. Hi, Rosemary. How are you? Are you visiting in the neighborhood? I don't think I've seen you around before." Rosarita squirmed uncomfortably. No, you haven't. On account of, I was just up here on vacation with Miss Zimmerman." Rosarita paused. "She's a friend of my family, a real good friend," she added quickly. "Yeah," Aggie added. "Mrs. What's-Her-Name and Rosemary's family are real good friends. They really are. Only Mrs. Zimmerman," said Rosarita, giving Aggie a dirty look. "Yeah, Mrs. Zimmerman. Well, old Ole, you know him. He left Mrs. Zimmerman his farm, and she and Rosemary came up to look at it, and last night Mrs. Zimmerman wandered off into the woods out behind the farm, and she disappeared." "Yeah," said Rosarita. "I think she must have gotten lost. Anyway, I can't find her anywhere, and I'm getting scared." Rosarita held her breath. Would Mrs. Sipes believe this tale? "Oh, Rosemary!" exclaimed Mrs. Sipes, putting her arm around her. "What an awful thing to happen. Look, I tell you what I'll do. I'll get on the phone and call up the sheriff's office, and they'll get some of their men out there right away, quick, to search for her. There was someone who got lost in the woods up here only last year, and they found him before he got hurt, so don't worry. Your friend will be all right." Inwardly, Rosarita breathed a sigh of relief. She hated to lie about Mrs. Zimmerman's disappearance, and she was, in reality, worried sick about her, but she just didn't know what Mrs. Sipes would say if she were to tell her that Mrs. Zimmerman had disappeared right into thin air. Later, after the call to the sheriff's department had been made, Rosarita was sitting at a long dining room table with Aggie and 7 other children, and Mrs. Sipes. Rosarita was sitting at the head of the table, in the place where Mrs. Sipes usually sat. Mrs. Sipes was away overnight, Mr. Sipes was away overnight in Petoskey on business. Rosarita looked around the table. It was a worried-looking family. They all had those long faces and upturned eyebrows. There were tall kids, short kids, 5 boys and 2 girls, counting Aggie, and a baby in a high chair. On the table was a big platter of corned beef, potatoes, onions, and carrots, and there were more vegetables and some dumplings, and in the 2 smoking dishes that stood nearby. There was a cutting board with freshly baked bread on it, and there were 2 big pitchers of milk. Mrs. Sipes said grace, and then everybody dug in. "Let Rosemary have some first," said Mrs. Sipes. "She's our guest, you know." It took Rosarita a second to recognize her new name. In fact, she was so startled when someone shoved a tureen of mashed carrots at her. "Oh, thanks," she mumbled. And then she helped herself to some. Later on, when everyone else had been served, Mrs. Sipes said in a loud, clear voice, "Children, I think you should know that Rosemary here has had an accident. The friend she was traveling with was lost in the forest, and we're trying to find her. We sent the sheriff's patrol out to look for her." "I think anybody who gets lost in the woods over here must be really dumb," said a tall boy with black curly hair. "Leonard," said Mrs. Sipes in a shocked voice, "that will be quite enough of you." She turned to Rosarita and smiled sympathetically. "I must apologize for my rude son. Tell us, Rosemary, where do you come from?" "New Zebedee, ma'am. It's a little town way down near the bottom of the state. Probably you never heard of it." I think I know where it is, said Mrs. Sipes. Now then, I really think we'd better notify your parents. They'll want to know what's happened. What is your father's name? Rosarita stared at the tablecloth. She stuck out her lower lip and looked as sad as she could. My folks are dead, both of them. I live with my Uncle Jonathan. He's my legal guardian, and his name is Jonathan Barneveld. He lives at 100 High Street. Mrs. Sipes looked surprised and saddened. My lord, you poor girl, what a string of misfortunes. First your parents dead, and now this happens to you? Tell me, my dear, how did it happen? Rosarita blinked. How did what happen? How did your parents happen to die? Excuse me for going into something so sad right at the present moment, but I couldn't help wondering what had happened to them. Rosarita paused. There was a mischievous gleam in her eye. She was beginning to enjoy her own lying. At first, she had been afraid of being found out, but now that Mrs. Sipes had swallowed both the Lost in the Forest story and the orphan story, not to mention Rosarita's fake name, Rosarita began to think that she would swallow anything, and inwardly she was chortling at her own cleverness in having made up the part about Jonathan being her guardian. There was a good one, since it would allow her to call up Jonathan and find out what she wanted to know without any more fooling around. Rosarita had intended just to say that her folks had been killed in a car accident, but now she decided to try for something fancy. It wouldn't do any harm. My folks got killed in a funny kind of way, she began. You see, my dad used to be a forest ranger. He used to walk around in the woods a lot and make sure there weren't any forest fires and that kind of thing. Well, one day he came across a beaver dam, and it was a really weird-looking kind of dam, all messy and screwed up. My dad had never seen a beaver dam that looked like it. Not ever, and he wondered how come it looked the way it did. You see, what he didn't know was that the dam had been built by a beaver that had rabies. And then my dad brought my mom out to look at the dam, and the beaver bit them both, and they died. Silence. Dead silence. Then Aggie's sister tittered, and one of the boys laughed. Gee, said Leonard in a loud, sarcastic voice. I would have thought that if a beaver had rabies, he would have just run off into the woods and die. Wouldn't you think so, Ted? Yeah, said the boy who was sitting next to Leonard. I never heard anyone getting bit by a beaver that had rabies. And anyway, if that's what really happened, how'd you ever find out? If your folks got bit and died, they wouldn't have told you nothing, would they? Rosarita could feel her face getting red. Everyone was looking at her. She stared at her. Everyone was looking at her, and she felt as if she were sitting there without any clothes on. She stared hard at her plate and mumbled, it was a real rare kind of rabies. More silence, more staring. Finally, Mrs. Sipes cleared her throat and said, Rosemary, I think you'd better come into the other room with me for a minute, if you don't mind. And Aggie, you'd better come too. Aggie got up and followed Rosarita out of the room. With Mrs. Sipes leading the way, the glum little procession wound its way up the stairs and into a bedroom at the front of the house. Rosarita and Aggie sat down side by side on the bed, and Mrs. Sipes closed the door softly behind her. Now then, she said, folding her arms and staring hard at Rosarita. I have heard incredible stories in my time, but this one just about takes the cake. I thought there was something odd about that orphan tale. But Rosemary, by the way, is that your real name? Rosarita shook her head. No, ma'am, she said in a tearful voice. It's Rosarita. Mrs. Sipes smiled a faint little smile. Well, at least it's fairly similar. Now listen, Rosarita, she said, staring straight into her eyes. If you're in some kind of trouble, I'd like to help you. I don't know what moved you to concoct this ridiculous story about the beaver, but you'll have to lie better than that if you want to grow up to be a con man or a con girl or whatever it is you want to be. Now, do you suppose you could tell me honestly and truly what happened and why you're here? Rosarita glared balefully at Mrs. Sipes. She wondered what Mrs. Sipes would say if she told her about the patch of trampled grass with no path leading away from it. I told you, Mrs. Sipes, said Rosarita stubbornly. I told you that my friend Mrs. Zimmerman is lost. I don't know where she is, honest to God. Well, my dear, I suppose that part of your story may be true, but I have never heard such an atrocious lie as that beaver story. Really, I haven't. Bit by a rabbit beaver, indeed. And now you tell me that your real name is Rosarita. All right, let's have some more of the truth. Are your parents dead or alive? My folks are alive, said Rosarita in a dull, hopeless voice, and their names are George and Louise Pottinger, and they live at 39 Mansion Street in New Zebedee, Michigan, and I'm their daughter. I really am. Honest, cross my heart and hope to die. Mrs. Sipes smiled sympathetically at Rosarita. There now, isn't it easier to tell the truth? Not much, thought Rosarita, but she said nothing. Mrs. Sipes sighed again and shook her head. I don't understand you, Rosarita. I honestly don't. If it's true that you're traveling with a friend of your family's named Mrs. Zimmerman... It's true, all right, said Rosarita, interrupting, her handbag still on the kitchen table in that crummy old... It's true, all right, said Rosarita, interrupting. Her handbag is still on the kitchen table in that crummy old farmhouse, and it's probably got her driver's license and a lot of other stuff in it with her name on it, so there. She folded her arms and glared fiercely at Mrs. Sipes. Very well, said Mrs. Sipes calmly. As I was saying, if that part of your story is true, why on earth did you try to hide your parents' identity? An answer sprang into Rosarita's head, an answer that was partly true. On account of my dad doesn't like Mrs. Zimmerman. He thinks she's a screwball, and if she turns up alive, my dad'll never let me go anywhere with Mrs. Zimmerman ever again. Oh, now I think that's being rather hard on your father, said Mrs. Sipes. I don't know him, of course, but it's hard to believe that he'd think Mrs. Zimmerman was a screwball just because she got lost in the woods. Lots of people get lost every day. Yeah, thought Rosarita. But if he ever found out Mrs. Zimmerman was a witch, he'd sure go through the roof. Besides, he can't help us. Uncle Jonathan is the only one that can. Rosarita wriggled impatiently and dug her heel into the rug. She felt like a prisoner. If only Mrs. Sipes would go away so she could call Uncle Jonathan and find out what to do about Mrs. Bigger. He could give her a magic formula to use, and then everything would be all right. It was all very frustrating. It was almost like having your hands on something and having someone slap your hands away every time you made a grab. She needed that book, the magic book with the funny name, but she couldn't do a thing until Mrs. Sipes left her alone. While Rosarita sat there stewing, Mrs. Sipes rattled on about responsibility and honesty and how your parents were really your best friends if you gave them half a chance. When Rosarita tuned back in on her, she was saying, and so I think that what we have to do now is call your folks up and tell them what happened. They'll want to know that you're okay. Then I'll drive over to the Gunderson farm to see if everything is all right. You probably left everything wide open, and there are people who just walk in and take things, you know. After that, all we can do is wait. Mrs. Sipes walked over and sat down next to Rosarita on the bed. She put her arm around her. I'm sorry to have been so hard on you, Rosarita, she said softly. I know you must be very upset because of what happened to your friend, but the police are out there now combing the woods. I'm sure they'll find her. Fat chance, thought Rosarita. But again she said nothing. Now if only Mrs. Sipes would get in her car and go over to the farm and leave her alone. Go away, Mrs. Sipes. Go away. First, though, Rosarita had to call her folks up. There was no getting around that. The three of them went downstairs, and Rosarita called up her parents long distance. Mrs. Pottinger answered the phone, and Rosarita once again recited her story about how Mrs. Zimmerman had disappeared from the Gunderson farm in the middle of the night and had probably gotten lost in the woods. Mrs. Pottinger was the sort of person who got flustered easily, and when she heard of Mrs. Zimmerman's disappearance, she really got rattled, but she told Rosarita not to worry, that she and Mr. Pottinger would be up there as soon as they could, and she insisted on being called the moment there was any news about Mrs. Zimmerman. Then Mrs. Sipes took the phone and she gave Mrs. Pottinger directions for getting to the Sipes farm. After that, Mrs. Pottinger talked to Rosarita a few minutes more, and then she hung up. And then after a bit of fussing, Mrs. Sipes got into her car and drove off in the direction of the Gunderson farm. Rosarita stood by the front window, watching Mrs. Sipes' car as it disappeared over a hill. Aggie stood by her watching with her habitual worried expression. And we'll pause there.